Welcome to this special debate hosted by Podlitiek and Marula Media. Today we tackle the age-old question and big debate topic, individualism versus communitarianism, a debate which has been raging since the 18th century between Thomas Paine and Burke. How do you protect the rights of communities? How do you ensure that the individual is protected against collectivism and populism? Well, tonight we attempt to answer these questions, not to provide final answers, but to further this debate and to further the discussions that we've had over the centuries and over the past years, specifically within South Africa's contemporary place and space. I am your host, Daniel Elof, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce our four speakers for tonight's debate. In defense of communitarianism, we have Ernst and Ernst van Staden. Ernst Roets is the head of policy and action at AfriForum. In 2016, he obtained his master's degree cum laude, and he is a current doctoral candidate at the University of Pretoria with a particular focus on the protection of community rights. Ernst is a published author and well-known figure within the public discourse sphere. Ernst van Staden is an alumni of the Stellenbosch University, where he completed his undergraduate degree in BA Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, and he also has his honors degree. He is currently a campaigns coordinator at AfriForum, focusing on strategy and content. He is an avid podcaster and YouTuber, where he's currently the host of the In Alle Ernst podcast, as well as a co-host of the Podlitiek podcast. Then representing the individualist cause, we have Hermann Pretorius and Martin van Staden. Hermann Pretorius is the deputy head of policy and of development at the Institute for Race Relations, and he is also a graduate of law, and interestingly also a graduate of opera. And Hermann Pretorius is also a podcaster and a well-known figure within the public discourse space in South Africa. Then we have Martin van Staden. Martin is the head of legal at the Free Market Foundation and also the editor-in-chief of the Being Libertarian Publications Group, which amongst other includes the popular South African liberal website, The Rational Standard. Martin is a published author and also currently completing his master's degree at the University of Pretoria. Interestingly, for our listeners out there, Martin and Ernst both share the same study supervisor with their postgraduate studies at the moment. And quite interestingly, that Martin is focusing on the protection of individual rights within the South African context, and Ernst is busy looking at various legal models around the world on how to protect community rights. Well, there you have it. And the debate of the structure of today's debate will be as follows. Each speaker will have 5 minutes for opening remarks to introduce their cause and their side of the debate. Thereafter, it will be followed by roughly 40 minutes of an open discussion where I will subtly ensure that this debate remains collegial and also friendly, yet pointed and specific. At the end of the debate, each speaker will have 2 minutes to give their closing remarks. It gives me a great pleasure, therefore, to welcome our first speaker, Ernst Roets, to start off and kick off today's debate.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to all the other participants who are here. Individuals do not flourish through the destruction of their roots and institutions. It is as a result of those roots and through those institutions that they flourish. In the 1960s, the Italian community of Roseto in the United States was a cause of great pondering when it was discovered that in that community, no one under 55 years old had died of a heart attack or showed any sign of heart disease. The local death rate for men over 65 was half the national average. An investigation found that the community had unhealthy habits. They worked in quarries and factories, they smoked unfiltered cigars, they ate rich and fatty Italian foods. What they did find, however, was that Roseto had a particular strong sense of community. It was normal to find 3 generations under one roof. Respect for the elderly was a particularly important value. 80% of men were members of at least one community group. They would gather in each other's houses, they would play cards, and they would talk about community affairs. The conclusion was that Rosetans were nourished, not by their healthy habits, they were nourished by their community. In the decade that followed, the community lifestyle gradually broke up. By 1971, the first person under 55 died of a heart attack. By the 1980s, the community had become more individualist and had adopted a liberal lifestyle. By then, the heart attack rate was the same as the rest of the country. For the purpose of this debate, when we say individualism, we are not referring to the everyday use of the term, which is that people should find and express their own individuality. We mean the ideology of individualism, the ideology of sociological individualism, to be precise, as championed by liberalism. The belief that society is merely a great collection of individuals pulled together. Communitarianism is stewardship, or rentmeesterskap in Afrikaans. The idea that what you have isn't truly yours. It was handed to you by those who came before you, and it is your duty to hand it over to those who will come after you. We will argue that liberalism is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, that liberalism leads to statism and a decline in liberty, that liberalism is imperialist in nature, that liberalism is anti-morality and anti-culture, that liberalism is an ally of Marxism, that communitarianism is the true state of nature, and that communitarianism maximizes liberty. The difference is this: if a leftist, a liberal, and a communitarian were to go for a stroll in the forest, the leftist would see only the forest, the liberal would see only the trees, the communitarian would see both the trees and the forest. The leftist would regard the trees as a threat to the forest. The liberal would regard the forest as a threat to the trees. And the communitarian would see the trees and the forest as interdependent of each other. Why are movies like Braveheart and Gladiator so popular? Why do people who aren't Scottish get goosebumps when William Wallace chooses the word freedom over mercy, knowing that it would lead to his death? Because people associate with Wallace's quest for community, for the freedom of his community, to be precise. All the best stories are about communities fighting for the common good. On the other hand, who would cry in a movie, let alone spend money on a movie that is about some bloke fighting for his individual freedom to smoke what he wants, or for a pregnant woman to abort her unborn baby? As individualist as Hollywood is also capitalist. And Hollywood has learned through empiricism which stories resonate with people and which don't. They might not have awarded American Sniper with a significant award, but that doesn't change the fact that it was the highest grossing film of the year. To conclude, why is The Lord of the Rings such a fantastic story? The Lord of the Rings is a story about communities, or nations, if you will, forging alliances and devising strategies on how to protect their cultures, customs, and traditions against an imperialist regime that seeks to destroy their way of life and enforce homogeneity on them. That is why the Rohirrim chant the word death as they ride their horses into an imperialist army attacking not their city, their neighbors, because they recognize as the world people that theirs is a cause worth dying for, and that the destruction of nations is the world's ending. Individualism is not Merry and Pippin finding a shortcut to mushrooms or having a long expected party. Individualism is more like the Dark Lord Sauron, using violence to enforce his will onto others by destroying their communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernst, and I thank you for opening what will definitely be a wonderful debate between the four of you. I now give over the microphone, or the online microphone, to my friend Hermann Pretorius to kick off the debate and also the defense of individualism for both him and Martin.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Ernst. Thank you, other Ernst, and thank you, Martin. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This really is an interesting exercise. So where this debate started was from a tweet by Ernst, Roets, the first speaker, and we'll navigate our way around the duality of Ernst's here. Where he tweeted, "In a liberal democracy, it is fairly easy to trample on minority rights without violating the rights of an individual. Individual rights are not sufficient." I retweeted this, replying, "Inviolable individual rights allow people the freedom to assimilate as they choose and have those assimilations be protected. Individual rights are sufficient." Now, when we use the word sufficient here, we do not, of course, use it in the absolute exhaustive philosophical sense of sufficient. No one would think individual rights in and of themselves are sufficient. You also need the ability to act on those rights, the desire to act on those rights. So when we say sufficient, we mean it as a sufficient basis on right and in terms of what can be acknowledged as rights. I will, during this debate, Martin, I will try to provide some insight into why individualism, or at least focus and a priority of individual rights, weigh heavier and should weigh heavier. And I must point out at the very start here that the two Ernsts have a very heavy burden of proof. They need to establish, firstly, that it is fairly easy to trample on minority rights without violating the rights of an individual. That's a very strong claim to make, and I think a claim that they should back up with some examples. And then secondly, we can go on to the sufficiency or insufficiency of individual rights. So it might be surprising for my side of the debate to start our argumentation by acknowledging and even emphasizing the value of groups and the value of minority interests. Martin and I are, after all, today acting as a group of two people, and it certainly is in our group's interests to win this debate. Martin and I are proud members of several other groups. I work for an organization, he works for an organization, both seeking to advance classical liberalism and liberty in a country where it's disappointingly alien. We are both Afrikaners, and we are both Christians. And ironically, we both belong to a group of avid individualists. Now, you run into a problem in this kind of debate, and that you have to start definitionally with a definition of what a right actually entails. And I think an uncontroversial definition for purposes of this debate is the ability to have certain freedoms and certain choices on which the holder is free to act within the constraints of their responsibility not to infringe on the same of others. Now, it is very important from the outset of this definition to note that the holder of a right is automatically assumed to be in some form of social grouping. By virtue of not being allowed to infringe on the rights of others, the individual bearing rights must be considered to stand by almost Aristotelian reason in relation to others, a community, as it were. So do not make the mistake of thinking those in favor of individual rights being regarded as paramount deny the inherently common attribute of human beings as creatures of groups or aggregates. Now, for the communitarian side of this debate to be entirely successful, they need to shoulder the two burdens that I set out at the beginning. Firstly, that it is possible to trample on minority or group rights without violating individual rights. And secondly, therefore, that individual rights are not sufficient. And they run into some significant challenges. On the definition of what a right is, it assumes a singular decider. A singular decider decides. The difficulty they face is not an impossible, it's not insurmountable, but they do face the difficulty of showing how a group can be the holder of rights where those group rights are not contingent on, firstly, individual rights being pulled freely. And I think Martin might make a very strong point by referring to the lifestyles of the Amish people and what they have been able to achieve in a broadly liberal framework. Then the last difficulty they face is the fact that the accountability of groups and individuals run into incredible turbulence on their worldview. Throughout this debate, we will seek to establish why, if you have an interesting group, if you have an interest in group interests, then you have to side with the individualists. If you have an interest in minority interests, you have to side with the individualists. If you have an interest in the free market or in liberty, then you really are falling on this side of the debate. And the two Ernst should be aware of the heavy burden of proof that they need to shoulder.
Thank you, Hermann. And then to continue the cause for the communitarians, we now welcome Mr. Ernst van Staden.
All right, thank you, Daniel. I'm assuming my time starts now. So it was Edmund Burke that said, "You will smile here at the consistency of those democratists who, when they are not on their guard, treat the humbler part of the community with the greatest contempt, while at the same time they pretend to make them the dispositories of all power. What communitarianism advocates is more communal autonomy and less government interference and social engineering. Wendell Berry notes how a community is built on a rich collection of personal relationships that draw from a reservoir of common memory and tradition. Communitarianism is based on the idea that not only do you want such aspects respected in regards to your own culture, but that you also grant that to other cultures as well. It has a foundation of mutual recognition and respect, very important, as well as an anti-imperialist DNA. Communitarianism is not an ideology, but rather a plea for the recognition of reality. A society of communities managing themselves is much more free and stable political environment than a society of individuals managed by one enlightened central state, acting as the babysitter, judge, jury, and executioner. Because the rights are secured by the cultural arrangements that constitute non-state power, self-determining groups, not the state, secure individual rights in practice. When communities are allowed more power to take their destiny, safety, and governments into their own hands, you create a necessary mechanism for relieving societal tensions. There is significantly more potential for friction and conflict in a society of communities forcefully pulled together under the rule of one majority government, which tries to micromanage all these affairs as a collection of individuals, than a society of largely self-determining communities. Communities are then forced to attempt to determine their destiny and their safety through only one avenue, democratic party politics, which creates a serious conundrum for minority groups, as we've seen ample examples of in South Africa. Individual rights are therefore insufficient to protect minorities against the tyranny of the majority in such a system. Individualists argue that a holistic state and its mechanisms such as the courts, South African human rights system, for example, and public protector will serve as the great equalizers between communities and cultures. But as we've seen throughout history and in the present, all it takes is one ideologically possessed administration to capture these institutions and use them to oppress not only individuals, but also minority groups. And because these communities have become reliant on the state to manage their destinies and their safety, they are powerless to fight an administration which diverges from the liberal ideals that created it. For example, they have been forced to rely on the state to manage their safety in regards to, for example, the police. And as we saw the consequences of that in South Africa during the lockdown, when the state prohibited neighborhood watches, or under Mbeki, when he disbanded the commando system, placing security and safety of communities primarily in the hands of the state, in the name of a government managing a society of individuals. In the pursuit of state-managed intergroup harmony, the inevitable logical endgame of liberalism was always going to be an increasingly detailed, authoritarian, and explicit state bureaucracy and legislation, in order to manage all the different groups in a society as a collection of individuals. The main obstacles standing between liberals and the individualist utopia are the pesky cleavages and borders of culture, language, and religion. And the only way to overcome this, it seems, is therefore to slowly chip away at these cleavages and move towards a holistic society of individuals rather than communities. And there seems to be no way of achieving this through other means than a benevolent technocratic state. At the core of liberalism is the concern that the state could oppress the individual. But ironically, in order to protect the individual, the liberal state increasingly imposes an atomistic lifestyle on communities and cultures. The previous century is often characterized as showing us the evils of forced separation through state coercion. But I contend that the post-Berlin Wall era could easily show us the evils of forced integration of communities into an atomized, formless whole. Where the classical liberalism of the Enlightenment was a reaction to the authoritarian oppression of the individual, I see the resurgence in communitarian and conservative thinking in our time as a reaction to the excessive and often imperialist individualism. People want politics to be about greater things, about morality and civil society. And when liberals and progressives fail to satiate these longings with their technocratic and sterile view of politics, populists who gladly rushed in where liberals feared to tread filled that void. In many cases, these populists then incrementally started perverting the liberal institutions and interpreted constitutions as they wished, ushering in a tyranny of the majority. using the tools and power that liberalism provided. For the vast majority of human history, culture and tradition managed and maintained everything the contemporary holistic liberal state, which manages society as a whole instead of recognizing its various parts, attempts to control. Tradition is a set of solutions for which we have forgotten the problems, as Donald Kingbury said. And if you discard these solutions in the name of a new, enlightened, individualist way of thinking, do not be surprised as some of the problems return and are as powerful as ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernst. And to conclude the opening remarks, I hand over to Martin van Staden to also wrap up the opening remarks on behalf of the individualists in today's debate.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so let me be controversial here. So I've been exposed to enough of the work of both the Ernsts to know that in practical reality, I think they and I, and including Hermann probably, agree about most things in public policy. We find ourselves both opposing quite fervently socialism and communism and social engineering and all the excesses of state power exercised in South Africa today. That's why I told Hermann a few times that I think this lively discussion will come down to a largely semantic disagreement that will have to do with what certain words mean, and group, individual, community, democracy, minority, majority, and rights are all examples of this. But I think in practical substance, we will agree about most things. And allow me to kick that off by reiterating what Hermann said, and that is that, yes, individualists are 100% in favor of any idea of community, and there's no tension even between the idea of a community and of individual rights. In fact, the whole idea of rights exists precisely because human beings are social creatures fundamentally. If it were true that liberals conceived of society as atomistic individuals who never come into contact with each other, and that there are no influences, no social forces, no communities, no cultures, no bonds, then there would literally be no point for rights. It is precisely because that we conceive of society, liberal individualists conceive of society as precisely a communal, social, interdependent phenomenon, that there are individual rights, and those rights are there precisely to regulate how we interact with each other to ensure that there is peace and harmony. I definitely agree with Ernst Roets that individuals flourish because of institutions. And I think the classical liberal tradition can very proudly claim credit for being a very institutionalist ideology. For lack of a better word, the constitutional order we find ourselves in today is largely a classically liberal one, even though the content of constitutions are not necessarily classically liberal. The very logic of it all is a product of classical liberal thinking. People are nourished by community, said Ernst Roets. I agree, that is certainly true. Where the disagreement, I guess, again comes in, where it was mentioned that liberals conceive of society as a mere aggregate of individuals. And there's a point that Professor Koos Malan often makes, that he and I have debated quite often, and that is this idea that liberals conceive of society as the state and the individual with absolutely no intermediate institutions or intermediary institutions. I believe that is a misreading of history. That is not what liberals, at least in the classical liberal tradition, have ever claimed. Hermann mentioned that I would mention the Amish. I think it's a great example. In the United States, the very mecca of liberal individualism, there you have extremely conservative communities with very strong bonds and very strong cultural institutions, precisely allowed to do what they wish because of the liberal institutions of the country they exist in. You have individual rights like the right to bear arms. One cannot say that it's simply liberals simply expect the state to protect us when liberals conceive of the right to self-defense and the right of collective defense as instrumental to individual rights. Think about the growth of private security in South Africa, which is product of capitalism, and capitalism is the economics of liberalism. Make no mistake about that. You have this massive industry of private security officers in this country, which outnumber, I believe, both our military and our police force, because there was a market demand for it, and markets operate on individualist lines. We agree. I think we are agreed that there are cultural values that are handed down to you, and I think there's certainly maybe a moral obligation on you to hand those down. Certainly, there is no disagreement there. Where there is disagreement is that liberalism is about enforcing homogeneity in a violent and imperialistic fashion. I'm not sure why this is conceived of. Again, look at examples like the Amish, look at examples like Orania in South Africa, using a somewhat imperfect, liberal, democratic dispensation, their own private property again being something that is legally protected from within the classical liberal tradition, to exercise their communal rights. And that is the fruits of liberal individualism. That is essentially what I have to say in reply on the first in this first round, but I think it's worth again just making the point that Hermann made at the top, and that is that human beings are the only real choosers and decision makers, and their preferences determine both public and private actions. Groups do not decide. Any group decisions are the product of individuals making decisions and agreeing about it. That is reality. And I think liberal individualists can quite firmly claim the mantle of being cognizant of reality, and we await the communitarian response to that. I look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to all four of you for drawing the battle lines and laying the foundation for what I think will be a wonderful debate. And perhaps on exactly that point, let's start off this open discussion, the 40 to 45 minutes that we have in this debate, in this open dialogue between all of us, to just sort out, like you said, Martin, the semantics about this debate, so we can get to the, the actual real content that we're all and all our listeners are here for. So I'm going to give an opportunity to Ernst Roets to perhaps ask the first question to the individualists, seeing that this whole debate was, ignited because of a tweet that he posted. I don't know how many times Ernst should be warned about not tweeting things, but in any case, I'll hand over to him to perhaps start with his first question.
Thank you, Daniel. I'd like to ask a question, but obviously I'd like to respond to some of the comments that were made. So maybe I'll start with a question and then I'll head over to the comments. So the question is to Martin, but if Hermann wants to answer, he's more than welcome to do that as well. And that is, what do you see as the difference between the common good, the common purpose, and the greater good? And how do you see individuals achieving the common good as opposed to the greater good when the common good is not necessarily aligned with individuals' individual interest, but the common good of the community at large? Now, certain comments were made about, well, firstly, I'm grateful that our opponents in this debate have spent so much time making the case for communitarianism. It's great that we're not that far apart. There were several examples we used. The one was about the growth of private security in South Africa. I would say the growth of private security in South Africa is more evident of the failure of liberalism or the failure of individualism than the success thereof. And the point here, we've made the point, and hopefully we can get to that later, is one of our main arguments is that the ideology of individualism is not in line or is out of touch with human nature. And here's a great example. So we need to talk about theory, but then we need to talk about practice. What's happening in practice in South Africa? In theory, we have what is described by legal professors as the most liberal constitution in the world. If you go to law school, liberal professors would tell you that we have a fantastic constitution. It's the most liberal in the world. And it is, in theory. If you speak to a Marxist lecturer, they would tell you this is a progressive constitution. Why? Because the liberal framework within the constitution allows itself to be interpreted by people who have a particular allegiance to community, to their own community. So the community that wins the election is the community that uses this liberal instrument to further their goals. So the structure that was created as a result of liberalism is the problem. So rights can only be exercised in community with others, to get to the point about individual rights. The rights to freedom of association, expression, and so forth are dependent on the existing of a community. I don't think we disagree on that. If the community is destroyed by virtue of its institutions being destroyed, the right to freedom of association means nothing. For individual rights to be real and to be sustained, it is critical that the state does not in practice grant these rights, but in practice recognizes these rights. There's a difference. Government can only be checked through power dynamics, a concept that is completely destroyed by the exclusive recognition of individual rights. But the reason why liberals don't accept rights for communities and community institutions that aren't based on the idea of unlimited for the freedom of the individual, and I believe this is Hermann's question, is because liberals would rather have an oppressive state founded on a constitution that only recognizes the individual than a state in which government power is countered by community institutions with significant authority. Why do we say this? Because the idea of communitarianism that goes against the core of individualism is that people do not simply have rights. People have duties and people have responsibilities. And if you say to a person, you have duties, you have responsibilities, what you are saying in effect is you do not have unlimited freedom as an individual because you have certain duties that you need to comply with. Your freedom is limited. And if your ideology is one of exclusively promoting unlimited freedom for the individual, then in practice what happens is that the framework that you build and the way it's being applied seeks to destroy institutions that tell people that you have duties and responsibilities because you do not have exclusive individual rights. So let me conclude. It was thought that the state would be impartial with a bill of mere individual rights. It was expected that judges would interpret the Constitution in line with individualist liberal thinking, as opposed to the predetermined views of the ruling elite. The opposite happened. We've seen it across the world, and we see it in South Africa now, precisely for the reason that the individualist predisposition that people would appeal to liberal reason and rationality was wrong. The individualist constitution is not interpreted by liberal individualist judges necessarily, but it's by people who aren't necessarily individualists. It's really not that hard to understand. The fact that the constitution is interpreted the way it is, and the continued cognitive dissonance of some people with this legal system, with the state of the legal system, is evidence, once again, that the ideology of individualism is a pipe dream. It's not in touch with reality because people are communal creatures. And if you provide them with a document that, such as a constitution to interpret, people would interpret that constitution or document in line with their communal preferences. So the consequence is tyranny of the majority.
Daniel, could I perhaps respond to that?
Yeah, gladly. I think Hermann and Martin, I think you both were mentioned. Hermann, if you'd like to kick it off, sure.
No, I mean, there's just a raft of things that Martin and I are expected to defend that we do not hold as our view at all. We are not trying to defend democracy. We're not trying to defend the South African liberal democracy at all. We are debating whether individual rights are sufficient to protect group interests and minority interests. And you said we deny the existence of group rights. Again, just a red herring, not true. The amount of things that Martin and I are expected to defend, while they do not form part of any claim we have made, is quite astounding. But let me put it this way. The idea that the individual or the individualist requires state oppression is just a straight up denial or a misunderstanding of what the liberal state meant in the first place. The liberal state in the first place is a very narrow executive mandate. That is common cause, at least among classical liberals. I don't know which classical liberals you have been reading, but it does sound like a very alien form of liberalism. And again, let me just emphasize this point. I am a proud member of several groups I urge people to be proud members of groups. This idea that because I believe in individual rights, I have some animosity to institutionalized memory and identity is fanciful. And in fact, I mean, it's a fanciful red herring. It's a red herring with some glue and glitter on it. It's just, it's a nonsense. It's a straw man in the most weak sense of the word. So let me go back to where the burden of proof lies. The claim that started this whole thing is that individual rights can be kept intact while minority rights are trampled. I would like an example of where that is a realistic possibility.
Should we respond first, or is Martin first?
No, I think
I have a response.
Please go ahead. I think the whole point of this is to have a discussion.
Right, excellent. So firstly, Hermann, I would just like to, seeing as Daniel has said that we need to make sure that the definitions and all of our foundations are correct before we start building this debate house. Group rights basically mean that the Constitution gives recognition to communities, and that the constitutional order is set up in such a way that communities have more freedom. Groups have the freedom to establish and manage their own institutions, such as schools, churches, and universities. Now, firstly, thank you very much that you are willing to
deny that. We don't.
No, well, thank you very much that you are willing to concede that communities are of value. I think that's very important. But when you very deeply and passionately say, I do care about communities and I do value about communities, it's very reminiscent of the ANC saying they do care about equality and they do care about non-racialism. So that's just a little bit of alarm going off in my head. But I think we need to.
Oh, something is going off.
We need to get to a point where the point that Ernst Roets mentioned, where communities prescribe duties and responsibilities to their members. But if you are in full support of communities, that goes against the idea of individualism, because these communities will inherently prescribe duties and responsibilities to their members, which goes against the idea of absolute freedom, because duties and responsibilities are inherently anti-absolute freedom. But you asked for an example, and I think an excellent example would be the destruction of Afrikaans as a medium of education in public universities, a cause backed by the liberal intelligentsia, not just solely the Marxists. It is a testament to how individualism is not sufficient to protect minority communities. Now, the Afrikaans medium education, tertiary and before that, is now being kept alive by community organizations, not by liberal organizations, and it's being funded by them as well. So they're filling in the voids where the liberal democracy is.
Let me jump in here on a specific point. On a specific point.
Hold that, Hermann. Come on, give me a chance.
No, but the thing is, where the difference comes in is where the tire hits the road, where you have this very beautiful liberal constitution that every liberal.
No, it isn't.
Then at the same time, you don't see it in practice. You see the preservation of culture and community being left to those communities, not to the constitution itself.
Let me just jump in there. I have a relatively brief point. So on this last point of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction at public universities, that statement has many underlying premises that we can get into. And I would like to focus on what sets classical liberalism apart from all these other things that are today claimed to be liberalism. And that is an extremely strong emphasis on an institution that we call private property. The idea of a public university is anathema to what we believe. So we could have told you, liberals could have told you many years ago when the previous regime was in the process of nationalizing private universities, we would have said, do not do this, please, because what is going to happen down the line, you're going to have a different group come into political power, and they are going to impose the policies that you disagree with. That is the exact same with private schools. Many Afrikaans, very good Afrikaans schools today, I believe, started as private schools. That's certainly the case with many of the great English schools in this country, but progressively they were turned into public ownership. That is totally in conflict with what liberals believe should be the case, and that is that education should be private. It should be in the hands of communities, of individuals, of businessmen, And that is a function of individual rights. So to say that this is an example of where liberalism has failed, no. This is an example of where a collectivist thinking has failed, because the previous regime, and I just use it because I'm most familiar with the history, but around the world, regimes around the world say that it is in the interest of our community to nationalize this institution for the common benefit. And that's the question that Ernst Roets directed at me earlier, this idea of what is the common good. Now, the moment we get into that, and the moment we have the so-called self-determining community states, and I mean, you cannot escape the state. The state has been there, as far as I'm concerned, since the advent of human civilization. You're not going to escape it. The point is, how are you going to regulate it? Liberals say private property, make sure everyone has their own corner. They can put their stuff together and have Orania. I will always come back to Orania. It's such a great example of private property, the great liberal institution. Private property, it's brilliant, being used for these exact purposes that you want. And this is the claim of liberal individualism. This is, at the end of the day, exactly what it comes down to. It says, if you want to do these things, cultural institutions, your own schools, Amish community, your own moral code, Afrikanerdom, Zulu cultural exercises, if you want that, you need liberal institutions. And that is what I think history has shown. I think that the liberal democracies of the world, and I think the United States of America, stands head and shoulders above the rest of them. That is where this has worked. This is where individual rights has had its greatest application. And that is where you've seen communities exercise these rights. And then just my final point, and that is that that liberals had this unqualified acceptance of the current constitution. Now, those of the listeners who know about me, I'm a big defender of the South African constitution. That is it's a very pragmatic thing that I'm doing. I think it's important for our individual rights, for our communal rights, so that we use the tools at our disposal. But my employer, Leon Lowe, wrote a book, South Africa Dissolution, in 1986. He is a radical, rabid individualist libertarian. And what he and his wife in that book proposed was a canton system for South Africa, a system of extreme devolution of power, whereby the smallest locality would have its own essential sovereign status, and there would be a level of government above that, etc. Just a mishmash of strong intermediate institutions between the federal state and the individual. So I think it needs to be emphasized that it is a straw man, that there is an animosity from liberal individualism to communities. The greatest liberals in our history have been some of the greatest proponents of community. And I think the only difference, and this will be addressed as we go forward, that Ernst van Staden correctly pointed out, is this idea of what gets to trump. What gets to trump the other? Does the community's will get to trump the individual's will, or do individual rights get to trump the so-called community will, whatever that might be? And I think we're going to get into that. Of course, individual rights proponents would say that the individual rights have to trump. But yes, I've interrupted Hermann, so thank you.
No, I'll make a very quick statement here. I see Ernst Roets is itching to jump in here. The problem with the education, the mother tongue education, is that was a violation of an individual right, not of a group right. Oh, well, it was the violation of a group right as well. It was primarily the violation of an individual right. So I don't grant that that is a good example. You've answered the question, but you've given a bad answer. So perhaps Ernst Roets will now take this opportunity to give a better example, one that actually hangs together, of where individual rights were kept intact, but group rights were trampled on.
Just before I give over to Ernst, I just want to say, Martin and Hermann, you both said you'll be quick and make brief points. But we quite enjoy it. So now I'll give a quick opportunity for Ernst to respond.
I'll be just as quick as they were. Now, let me start with, there's a few things. So let's start with private property. I mean, we are, as you know, we are great advocates for private property, but this is a great example. So what happens when a community says that their community is not based on the idea of private property? What is the liberal or the individualist view towards the Ingonyama Trust, towards Queen Goodwill Zwelithini, towards a community that says, we do not want private property. If you live on this property, you do not have property rights. And now you can say, well, that's okay. We should accept that. But what happens then if someone who lives there goes to court and says, I want my right to private property to be protected? What would the consequence be? The consequence would be a court ruling in favor of the individual that destroys the cultural institution. But let me show you something. This is how the debate is going pretty much as we expected it would. Now, I want to show you my preparation notes. It says, liberalism is anti-culture. Hermann calls straw man. Explain why. But let me give you a quote, other than the language issue. Here's a quote from the South African Constitutional Court in the case of AfriForum versus Tshwane. Any reliance by white South Africans, particularly white Afrikaner people, on a cultural tradition founded in history finds no recognition in the Constitution because that history is evidently rooted in oppression. That's the South African Constitutional Court that says that.
Yeah, but you see, Ernst, we don't have to defend that. That's not in contention. Martin and I aren't saying here that we're defending the decisions of the Constitutional Court. That's an awful, awful decision.
That's the point.
So let me put it this way. In the Ingonyama Trust
I'd like
case,
to finish my point. I haven't gotten to the conclusion. So we know that's the point. We know that you're not defending that position. And that's why we're saying that liberalism is out of touch, is suffering from a dissonance of human nature, because this decision was the result of a structure created as a result of liberalism. Let me explain to you why. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. We know that. To suggest that checks in balance and balances in a liberal dispensation are somehow, firstly, that it's a liberal concept is not in touch with history. We know that back to Aristotle and Plato, people spoke about mixed government and so forth. To say that liberalism isn't anti-community because you are a liberal and you don't have a problem with community is a bit like Joseph Stalin saying that he's not a tyrant because look at all the alive people who are still walking around in the Soviet Union. Liberalism accepts, and here's the point, liberalism accepts civil society only insofar as civil society promotes liberalism. Liberalism might recognize civil society as legitimate, but it does not recognize the authority of civil society outside the authority of the state and the written statist individualist constitutional order. Liberals' goal, and I'll conclude with this, liberalism's goal is unlimited freedom for the individual, where civil society constitutes a natural cultural arrangement that amounts to some form of constraint for the individual, as do virtually all cultural institutions. Liberalism seeks to liberate the individual from that. This is at its core undermining of civil society. Natural group constraints and any form of power outside of the state. In practice, liberals support the state's right to dominate civil society that is regarded as illiberal. Liberalism actively seeks to demolish any form of arrangement or civil society that is not absolutely voluntary. So yes, we can have civil society and we can have also cultural institutions, but it must be absolutely voluntary. If it's not, then liberalism seeks to destroy that. Liberalism only supports civil society in as far as civil society supports liberalism.
It's very interesting.
The horror.
It's very interesting, Ernst, that you clearly didn't listen to my definition of what a right is and the definition of the right that Martin and I gave. We gave it intrinsically in terms of limitations with regards to a societal factor. So you're missing the boat on two scores. You're missing the boat that we are actually fundamentally acknowledging the social nature of man. And secondly, you are missing the limitations we place on it. This idea that we are in favor of unlimited individualism, I mean, that's just so gone stupid. It is this idea that everywhere man is free, or he is born free, but everywhere he is in change. That's just absolute utter nonsense. We do not advance unlimited individualism or unlimited freedom for the individual. And you ask, what about the Ingonyama Trust? That is exactly the point that Martin makes with the Amish society. Within their ability to have individual rights respected, they, as individuals, decided to form a community which culturally adheres to these community standards. You can say that Martin and I hate groups all you want. That does not make it true.
All right. So what the thing is that I think that the Ernst Roets is touching on, I think this will actually contribute to unraveling this cryness that we've entered here. So basically, the community firstly, I think we need to address that we see the world as it is rather than how we want it to be. You tell a very beautiful story, both of you, in regards to your theory. I really think that the majority of this audience thinks that that's how they want the world to work. But it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, Mogoeng doesn't believe in it. So why then should you think that reality is going to mirror that? So, but then my question would be, or one of my questions, firstly, is why can South Africa's liberal constitution be so effortlessly interpreted in a Marxist or pro-transformation way? But then secondly, I think, and this is the crux of it all, and I think this is something that Ernst Roets touched on, but I think is a very important question that liberals need to answer. And that is, but firstly, maybe I should give some context, or else I might be saying that I'm strawmanning you. So the Black Sash movement is a good example of how liberal movements are taken over by Marxists. And I'm talking now, this flows from the idea of why is our liberal constitution so easily interpreted in a Marxist way or in a transformative way. So the Black Sash movement was founded by liberals, but then by the late 1970s and onwards became increasingly taken over by Marxists. And to the point where today they are advocating for something akin to a universal basic income and drastically expanding the social grant system. And the ANC are another good example. They fundamentally started as a liberal organization as well, from their founding to the late 1940s. But look where they are now. The DA is another example. They're just a bit less late stage, where you have this party founded on liberal principles, increasingly embracing socialism and the welfare state. And therefore, my question would be twofold. Well, firstly, the first question is, why is our liberal constitution so easily interpreted in a transformative or Marxist way? And then secondly, why have we seen this historical propensity of liberal movements and organizations to ally with the Marxists? And secondly, why is there also this other trend of these liberal movements being taken over by Marxists time and time again?
Let me address the first point very, very, very quickly. It doesn't, I mean, it really doesn't speak to the core of this debate. The constitutional, the jurisprudential mistakes that Mogoeng make, or might make, or what the Constitutional Court makes, affects none of the points that Martin and I are actually holding in this debate. And it's very clear that you guys haven't shifted the burden of proof yet. Remember, you are moving you are the mover of the motion here. You bear the burden of proof to provide an example of where community rights were violated by keeping individual rights intact. You have not yet done that. And to answer these questions, firstly, your constitutional point, I mean, it's not straw manning, it's paper tigering. So I don't even have to look at that, because I'm not arguing that. I can only defend what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing for Mogoeng's jurisprudential competence. And then secondly, the idea of the Black Sash, well, that is just a very narrow reading of history. How about all the many collectivist movements and communitarian movements who have themselves been hijacked? That's, again, not a point of refutation of anything that Martin and I are defending. It is just you guys not being able to shift the burden of proof.
Can you name some examples?
I've been, let me just also get a chance here to just briefly, let me just build on what Hermann said on the Ingoniama Trust. I think it's a very important point. Private property is a factual state of affairs. It doesn't matter whether they call it private property or conceive of it as such. The point is, if it was acquired in the way private property ought to be acquired, and in our history, I mean, there's conquest, so you can say that by operation of that, it has become private property, but whatever. The point is, if you have property together and it's conceived of as communal, then so be it. But the liberal will say that's private property and the state should stay out. But let's get to the point, because we can't, we're not going to stay on the defensive. And I think Hermann's point here is important, that in every instance where tyrannies have come about, and I want to emphasize, in every single without exception, every single case, it has started by people appealing to community. Every single case, not once has a tyranny started with someone saying, we are going to come in here and radically protect individuals and individual rights and liberty, and then suddenly it is gulags and concentration camps. Every single time, without exception, it is an appeal to community. It is a populist appeal to community. Hitler, apartheid, the French Revolution, each single one of them. And yes, we have all these wonderful liberal organizations who have been taken over by Marxists, much to my and Hermann's dismay. It is a perversion of our tradition, and we fight that within our own movement. But just as we do that, bona fide good faith communitarians like yourselves who do not want to impose your will on others, although I do feel iffy about Ernst Roots's point about the horror of absolute voluntarism. Oh my goodness, that's terrible, voluntarism. I feel iffy about that, but I think you guys are good faith communitarians. And just like we have a duty to clean up our house, I think that you have a duty to clean up your house in the same way, and make sure that when there are appeals for politics based on the community interest, that it not spill out into these tyrannies that we have seen so constantly over human history, which the liberals are expected to clean up afterwards.
Thank you. I would love to get to some more examples that Hermann is asking for, because we've got a list of them, but I'll get to them. I think it's more important now to get to respond to the fascism, Marxism, Hitlerism arguments, because we know Godwin's law. We knew it would only be a matter of time before the debate goes to Hitler. The problem with Nazism was not the consequence of communitarianism. It was the consequence of the destruction of communitarianism. Nazism wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the destruction of the very fabric of German community that preceded it. Hitler was able to achieve what he did because of was able to achieve it because of populism, not because of communitarianism. What happened is a void was filled as a result of the destruction of communitarianism, and Hitler came in and filled that void. Also, the most significant problem with Nazism is not nationalism or groupthink, it's imperialism. Hitler wasn't merely driven by pride for his folk or his nation. Hitler was driven by a desire to conquer the world. In that sense, if Hitler was only driven by some sense of his folk, he would have been a horrible person for the German people. But it was the imperialism of Nazism that caused the Second World War. It was Hitler's disrespect for communities that caused the Second World War. It wasn't communitarianism that caused the Second World War. But but there's a point to be made here about fascism. And we've seen that. So the rise of communism and fascism is a predictable consequence of what is also, among others, the liberal attack on associations and communities. Because if communities are destroyed because of the fact that they do not uphold individual freedom, or that people's human rights are being violated as a result of certain community institutions, it creates a void. And we've seen that. This is why it's no surprise that the so-called liberation of the individual during the French Revolution led to the rise of Napoleon. This is why it's no surprise that the Rwandan government, before the Rwandan genocide, used liberal democracy as a scapegoat. They hid behind liberal democracy. They said, no, we're a democracy now, you have to leave us alone. And we have this liberal democratic framework, and this is within which we are operating. And this is also why the South African liberal political system is the perfect playing field for a revolutionary Marxist party. In fact, the ANC was so aware of this, they made a conscious decision during the negotiations for a new South Africa to present themselves as liberal, knowing that if they do so, they will get international support. And if they were to govern or reside over a liberal political dispensation, in other words, a liberal framework, it would provide them with the playing field that they were looking for. This is why the ANC said that the 1996 Constitution is a beachhead victory for the National Democratic Revolution. Marxists see this, communitarians see this. It's only individualists who don't recognize this.
Can I jump in here? Martin and I must be some of the worst liberals in the world. Our imperialist instincts are negligible at best. So if the idea is that, apparently I didn't know that I had to invade Poland to be a liberal. The problem here is that the claim is made that imperialism is inherently liberal. It isn't. It's inherently collectivist. It is the inherent advancement.
Liberalism is inherently...
No. Hang on.
I just want to correct it. Liberalism is inherently imperial, not the other way around.
All right, liberalism is inherently imperial. I still don't see the argument, but my critique of it holds. Imperialism is by definition collectivist. It is the advancement of the group, of the empire. So this idea that Martin and I are I don't know, closet imperialist is the most bizarre point of criticism I've ever heard against liberalism. It doesn't actually form part of anything that we've contended this evening. And the problem is, if we're actually going to look at what is in contention this evening, I'm surprised that this debate has turned into a defense and an attack of liberalism. The burden of proof isn't on Martin and myself to say liberalism good, liberalism bad. The burden of proof is on the people making the motion, you, Ernst and Ernst, to show that individual rights can remain intact with group rights successively being infringed on. The problem is you assume we make the case that group rights don't exist. Again, you're just simply wrong on that. We acknowledge group rights, but we acknowledge them as the pooling of individual rights. So every piece of criticism you level at Martin and myself for our hatred of groups just misses the actual point that we're making. It's very interesting that your preparation to this evening took you in that direction. It's just a pity the debate didn't follow your preparation. So that's the first point. We do not deny group rights. We strongly are in favor of group rights, but as a contingent of individual rights. And then the second point of actually shouldering the burden of proof. Give us that list. Give us a list that can prove that individual rights remain intact where group rights are being violated.
Sure.
Right. Well, firstly, I can see my colleague is itching to answer. I just have a very quick observation to make. I find it funny that whenever we use examples or name examples, you say they're not good enough examples, they're not good enough. And it very ironically matches up to the similarity between liberalism and communism, that you both share this logic of, oh, that wasn't real liberalism. But let's get to Mr. Roets.
So let me just get this straight. Is communism a form of collectivism or not? Because if it's not a form of collectivism, then I really should.
No,
lovely. Okay, so what's the tension between collectivism and individualism? Isn't there an inherent contradiction?
No, let me tell you. Well, let me get to first. We get somewhere. I will answer your question. The point is this. I'm a student at the University of Pretoria. When the University of Pretoria changed its language policy to say that Afrikaans is no longer a medium of instruction, my individual rights were not violated.
No, they were.
But the rights of the group were violated. Okay, you can say they were, but this just says again, I can argue that my rights were violated, but the fact that you say they were just shows again that this ideology that you are promoting is out of touch with reality. If I go
I have to agree with the constitutional. So I have to agree with the constitutional court to defend liberalism.
You have to live up to the consequences of your ideology. That's what you need to do.
I do.
If I go, you will agree with me. If I go to the constitutional court and say to them, I'm a student of the University of Pretoria or University of the Free State or whatever, and a decision was made that the language policy has to be changed and my individual rights were violated, you will agree with me that court will throw it out. You did not respond to the comment by the Constitutional Court about saying that the cultural tradition of white Afrikaners should not be protected or is not protected.
I did respond to that. I called it a terrible decision.
You agree.
No,
exactly. but it's
Adams,
the result of the ideology that you promote.
Let's be completely honest here. Please be honest. Please be honest.
You are particularly good at interrupting people.
Please be honest on this point.
Yes, please. Just a chance to conclude, and then you can respond.
I'll just make this quick point. Is it really your contention that Martin and I have to defend the full jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court in order to maintain our case this evening?
It's not our contention that you need to defend the full jurisprudence. It's our contention that you need to live up to what has been created in South Africa by the liberal ideology. This is the most liberal constitution in the world, and you seem to, every time someone fails, it fails down the line, you say, no, you tend to divert from it. But let me get to the point about Marxism and collectivism. You'd like me to respond to that. Marxism is a collectivist approach. it's also imperialist. What Marxism shares with communitarianism is one thing, that it recognizes that people associate in groups. Let me tell you what Marxism has in common with liberalism. Firstly, utopianism. It promises a better world if only you were to adopt our ideology. Second, imperialism, because it seeks to convert humanity to its cause. Thirdly, absolutism, because it absolutes the individual, liberalism, at the expense of the community. Fourthly, universalism, because it seeks to be applied all over the world on every living human being. Let me go, I'll speed it up. It's based, Marxism and liberalism, on a misunderstanding of human nature, on a denialism of the social order, on standardization of humanity, on hostility towards the past. It is anti-culture, it is anti-diversity, it is anti-institutions, it is anti-authority other than the authority of the state. It claims to be based on reason and rationality with capital R's. I'm talking about the ideology as a driving force. It's driven by a single narrative. It's statism, it promotes statism, and it's a concept of central planning. That's what Marxism has in common with liberalism. What Marxism has in common with communitarianism is one thing, collectivism.
Perhaps I could just respond to those points. I mean, they are astounding points. Utopianism, no. I mean, that's just, neither Martin nor myself have ever claimed that we pursue utopianism, so unfortunately you're wrong on that. Imperialism, again, I didn't realize I needed to invade Poland for this debate. Universalism, at no point did Martin and I make the point that liberalism should be applied universally. And then absolutism is this idea that we somehow do not contend for other interests other than the individual. Just straight up contrary to what we've been saying this whole evening, is that you do get group rights, but they are contingent on the individual rights. If you're going to debate our point, at least debate our point honestly.
I think there's another point here, and that is that how are we arguing for absolute voluntarism at the same time that we're being these violent imperialists? I think that there is a contradiction, at least an implied contradiction there. But to the extent that our expectation is that individuals should just be allowed to decide on their community, something that I think you do regard as important, both of you, because how would you feel if the state said, you're no longer part of the Afrikaner community? That is something that liberals insist on. We insist on it being absolutely voluntary. And not only from the perspective of the state, but from the perspective of the community. You as an Afrikaner and me as an Afrikaner, we don't get to tell Ernst van Staden, you are an Afrikaner, and we will force you to stay an Afrikaner. If you move to Canada, we will come at you with guns and say, you are an Afrikaner, what are you doing speaking the Queen's English? No, yes, we do want voluntarism. And to the extent that we will defend the voluntarism with force, if you want to call that imperialism, that's fine. I call it self-defense.
I forgot I was muted. I think the main thing that we need to understand here is pretty much the real world consequences. Like I said earlier, this where the tire hits the road. I think that's where the big debate is. We've touched on it quite a bit, but I think seeing as we are now in a time of civil liberties being rolled back, my question or my statement observation rather would be that hasn't the lockdown measures that we've seen worldwide been, and which have many been enacted by liberal democracies on their own citizens, demonstrated the flaws of liberalism in practice, not in theory, in regards to where communities have now just relied on the state because they were sold a beautiful story of liberalism, that they will be taken care of, their rights respected, and they will be able to, for example, defend themselves. But then you get this where governments just don't care. When there's a crisis, they say, well, give me liberty or give me death unless there's a crisis, then it doesn't matter. So then you get this absolute perversion of constitutions and individual rights, and the oppression of not only the minority communities, but also individuals. And you saw this in the United States. And I think this touches on a very, very important crux of this whole debate. And that's what me and Ernst are trying to say, is that you tell a very beautiful story. And like I said, everyone, I think that's how the world that we want to live in. But unfortunately, that is not the reality that we're seeing. The reality that we're seeing is pretty much just as soon as the pawpaw hits the fan, then that beautiful story is no longer really that important.
Let's do reality. And I must say, this is the first time I've heard argued that the lockdown is an outflow of overt individualism. I would have contended that the opposite is true, that you have these societal objectives and that the freedom of the individuals can be trampled on for the health of the whole. So it's a very interesting and I think a very almost unique perspective that the lockdown is an outflow of, too much individualism in government's decisions. And again, at no point this evening did Martin and I try to defend the action of liberal government. We're not defending liberalism. We're not defending liberal governments. We're not defending the constitutional court. We are placing, as again, the onus, the burden of proof on you to show us where group rights have been violated without individual rights being violated. And you have this very convenient thing of saying, no, it's not real group rights. It's I've been compared to the communist or the Stalinist, and that's very fascinating. It's very interesting, but it doesn't actually answer the challenge to your argument.
It was your team who mentioned communism and fascism. We only responded to.
Yes, and that's fine. That's fine. I mean, go ahead, quote away. But the idea that I'm saying, no, it's not true liberalism, just like the communists would say it's not true communism. Okay, fair. Be that as it may, it doesn't answer the challenge to your argument. The challenge to your argument remains, and I repeat it again, could you give us an example of where group rights were violated without individual rights being violated?
Guys, just before the two Ernsts jump in, perhaps we've gone over the hour mark. If you two would perhaps like to answer the last question, and then we can move over to closing remarks.
Sure, thank you. So the lockdown, let's use that as an example, and then I'll get to some more examples that you've been asking for. The lockdown is not so much the triumph of liberalism or individualism. The lockdown is the triumph of the ideology of rationalism. Rationalism is an ideology that says that some very smart intellectual person has made up this, has figured out how to solve the world's problems. And it's not necessarily connected to what's happening in reality. And that's one of the things, we're not saying liberalism is Marxism. That's one of the things that liberalism has in common with Marxism. Liberalism is a rationalist ideology. If you don't believe me, you can read all the thinkers, all the liberal thinkers. You can go and read Thomas Paine and John Locke. They all say that. Liberalism is rationalism, as opposed to empiricism. But let me give you some more examples. And I know because it's incentivized for you to just deny everything. Every time we give you an example, it's incentivized because if you were to concede, it would mean that you concede that you lose the debate. We gave you the example, and I think you agree that if I go to court and say my individual rights have been violated as a result of a university change in its language policy, the court would throw it out. But I'll give you some more. So, and you're supposed to know this. You know about the judgment in the Agri-SA case, which is the consequence of the political dispensation where we're in, where the court found for the expropriation of mineral rights without compensation. Now, you can say, oh, those people's individual rights were violated, but it wasn't. It wasn't in practice. In theory, yes. In practice, no. So you need to live up to the practice of liberalism, not the theory of liberalism. Because if you say you can take this, that it's not violated in practice, then by all means go to court and see what will happen. Let me give you another example. The Constitutional Court that found that BEE and affirmative action and representativity is constitutionally solid, that you can do that, you can implement that. That is a violation of group rights. It's not according to practice, liberal practice or practice in the South African dispensation. It's not a violation of an individual rights because the Constitutional Court, the highest court in this land, said this is not a violation of your individual rights. We can go further. We can go to the Helen Suzman versus President of RSA case, the Glenister case, where the court made a particular ruling about a historical narrative and all that goes along with it. We can go to the FETSAS case, where the Constitutional Court found that the government should have increased centralization of powers. The government should have control over who gets to be appointed on governing bodies and so forth. Now, you can say an individual's right was violated. In theory, maybe. In practice, no. Then we can go to the Tshwane versus AfriForum case. The court even went as far as using the term substance over form. Now, we can go into that, but what that effectively means is don't get too much bogged down in the theory. Let's look at what we need to achieve as an organization or a community that has taken control over this liberal framework, and we're now using it to promote a particular national democratic revolution. And the court said, and you haven't responded to that I quote again, any reliance by white South Africans, particularly white Afrikaner people, on a cultural tradition founded in history finds no recognition in the Constitution, because that history is inevitably rooted in oppression.
Can I respond to that now?
Yeah, sure, you can respond to that.
Again, Ernst, what you're essentially saying is that for Martin and I to defend liberalism, we have to defend the entire jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. It is an absurd relation. It is. Whether you try to maneuver away from it, the reality is I don't have to approve of the judgments made by a political court to defend liberalism. Liberalism doesn't even demand the existence of a constitutional court. Liberalism doesn't even demand the existence of a written constitution. Liberalism, as what we are defending here this evening, is essentially this thing you so despised, voluntarism. How, heaven forbid, people are entitled to make their own decisions. Heaven forbid people decide, like the Amish, to live in their community. Heaven forbid that the Zulus decide that they freely want to pool their individual rights in the Ingonyama Trust. If the greatest attack on our position this evening is that we are in favor of individuals exercising choice, then I gladly take that shot. But what you cannot do is try to maneuver or lever into this debate the idea that Martin and I are in lockstep with Mogoeng. That is just not what is in contention this evening. And to do so is fascinating. I mean, it's a great discussion, but you're not proving the motion. You're not shouldering the burden of proof.
Ernst, if you perhaps like to just conclude on that point, and then I'll go over to the closing remarks where Hermann will start off for us, so you can have a last word, and then we'll move to closing remarks.
Sorry, I wasn't, I had a bit signal. Were you speaking to me, Daniel?
Sorry, yeah, Ernst, you're more than welcome to respond to Hermann's last point, and then I'm going to hand over to him to start off with the 2-minute closing remarks.
Well, that goes back to the point about human nature, because there's a particular emphasis on voluntarism, and that's wonderful. I mean, we like voluntary associations, but the reality is that not all things in life are voluntary. Not all institutions are voluntary. You can be a member of a particular institution, and within that institution, your individual human rights could be violated, to use that term, in the sense that it's a particular cultural community organization that says if you want to be part of this institution, then you have to comply with our rules. And communitarianism is about recognizing that people do not only have individual freedom, people have duties and people have responsibilities. And that, by definition, the concept, you cannot say you want voluntarism and you're prepared to defend that with force, and then not in agreement when I say people have duties and responsibilities. The two don't, it's irreconcilable. You can't say, yes, you have duties, you have to fulfill your duties. And yeah, you have individual freedom to choose whatever you want to do. And if you don't, and if people tell you that you don't have a right to choose, we're going to use force if that's your line, that's a problem. That's the cognitive dissonance. You do not seem to grasp that there's a major difference between what you are arguing and what the practical consequences thereof are. So I'll conclude with this, is the concept of thymos or thumos, as Aristotle called it. It's people are not only driven by reason or rationality, and also not only driven by desire. These are two things that liberalism likes, reason and desire. There's a third thing, and that's the thumos, which is that people have a desire also for recognition for their inherent worth, for who they are, for their for to be part of a broader community. And yeah, sure, you can say, of course people do. But what happens in practice? In practice, we have people finding organizations or institutions that places limits on people's freedoms because it's a cultural institution and it has certain traditions that you need to comply with. And the moment it starts placing in practice limits on people's choice, that institution is regarded as an enemy of liberalism. And you've said it yourself, that you are prepared to use force to defend the idea that the voluntarism of the system. And if you say you are prepared to use force to defend the voluntarism of the system, you say, in fact, that you are imperialist and that you are prepared to destroy cultural institutions.
All right, let's give each speaker, well, starting with Hermann Pretorius, 2 minutes, and then we can wrap up.
All right. This has been a bizarre discussion. I have heard definitions of my worldview that I have never encountered before. I didn't realize that I had to be in favor of Lord Milner's approach or policy to the Boer colonies to be a liberal. I hadn't realized that I cannot belong to a church and be a religious member of a group if I wanted to be a liberal. The fundamental problem here is that communitarianism is, I think, an admirable element of human nature. It is something that Martin and I never denied. The group-based existence of humanity is, in fact, something that we worked into our very definition of what a right is. So as long as the Ernsts paint us as imperialists, opponents of groups, or the golf caddies of Mogoeng, they're not engaging with the argument. I mean, it makes good television, and AfriForum are very good at that, and they do brilliant work on that score. But the problem is it doesn't address the argument. You can call Martin and I all kinds of names. You can call us all kinds of things. Doesn't change what we put on the table this evening. It doesn't change the fact that you could never successfully shoulder the burden of proof in every instance you gave of where individual rights were perceived to be held intact, where group rights were not, are either, your definition either forces us to be in step with Mogoeng, something we don't have to be for the purposes of this debate and aren't in practicality. Or secondly, you just deny the fact that something like the right to education in mother tongue is an individual right. The weakness of those who proposed this evening's motion is that they couldn't even shoulder their own burden of proof. If you are going to say that group rights, or individual rights, are not sufficient, then you have to do better than saying Martin and I need to agree with Mogoeng in order to substantiate your point.
Right, and let's give over to Ernst Roets for his closing remarks.
I thought it was me next, but...
Ernst, if you want to jump ahead, you can go, by all means.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I think I'll keep it brief. I think that was one of the themes of this debate. It's something that I definitely want us to be a good example of. But firstly, well, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity, but I think we'll get to that at the end. So community values are implicit. The state has to be explicit, and increasingly so. And you once mentioned on Podlitiek, Hermann, that classical liberalism only can work if it is applied holistically, and it needs, therefore, a holistic state. And a holistic state, and this is there's your end of your quote, but a holistic state, as I understand it, needs to be a technocracy where the best and the brightest are in charge and the experts lead. But I think the idea of the lockdown coming as a topic of discussion proves the fact that sometimes the experts are just as ideologically possessed as their layman brothers. So I think one of the key themes here that we touched on, but the conversation was definitely forced away from it, maybe for obvious reasons, is the similarities between, firstly, liberalism and imperialism, and liberalism and Marxism. And I think this is a question maybe to stew at the back of your mind, if I can address the audience directly. I want the liberals to stop hiding their Marxist cousin in the attic. When you say that, well, here's an example of a liberal organization that has not turned Marxist, that's not how this thing works. There's a reason we talk about the correlation between smoking and cancer, because we've observed a trend. And you are basically saying that we're pointing at, well, my uncle is 100 years old and he's been a smoker since he was 13 years old. He didn't get cancer. Well, I think that's not how science works. But anyway, or trends work rather. And I see a very, very clear trend of liberal organizations getting cancer. I mean communism. So practicality, I think, is the big thing here. And when you mentioned, for example, that you care about communities, like I mentioned earlier, and I think this is definitely something that I will go out on, and a hill I will die on, is the fact that I really get a strong vibe of the same type of ANC dedication to non-racialism and equality. But where the tie hits the road, and this was our crux of our entire argument tonight, was that in reality, that utopianism is not reflected, and those beautiful stories don't translate into reality. So where you say, where the liberal and individualist mantra is man can be what we want him to be, the communitarian mantra is simply man is what he is.
Thank you, Ernst. And then Martin, who I might add, I just want to say I'm completely shocked to see you in a hoodie tonight and not in your formal suit and tie as usual. I'll give over to you to conclude on your behalf.
It's quite cold today, so hoodie. Yeah, so let me just say that the constant appeals to realism and practice are counterproductive. Liberalism has many, many feathers in its hat. If you look at economic freedom of the world indices, if you look at human development indices, if you look at human freedom indices, you'll see that the most liberal societies in the world are by far the most productive societies, the happiest societies, and the freest societies. So those who claim to push for community interests tend throughout history to instead impose tyrannies. They may not be real communitarians. I guess this is something that communitarians, communists, and liberals have in common. People claim things and then they end up doing other things. None of us can help that. Our opponents have repeatedly said that we need to live up to practice and not theory, by referring to South African courts, for instance. But there is no point to this, as I said, because for every instance of a so-called liberal institution being perverted, there are at least 5 instances of involuntary communitarianism being imposed somewhere in the world. This constant thing about liberals and Marxists being close to each other, I know this is a very popular argument during the previous regime, and it's something that liberals still need to endure today. But the fact is that since Marxism came about, liberals have been their biggest opponents, hands down. The United States went to war, sure. It was, to the extent you want to call that, a very defensive war against the tyranny of communism, imperialistic. Whatever. Liberals are the biggest opponents of Marxism. That should be clear to everyone paying attention. And then the last point made by Ernst Roets, what was it? There's a cognitive dissonance between insisting on the right to choose. This word absolute keeps being used, but I'm not going to use that. I haven't used that. And recognizing that people could have duties, that there's this tension. I regard this as somewhat absurd. As Ernst knows, obligations arise out of voluntary agreements. We call this a contract. We agree as individuals, exercising our free choice to comply with certain duties, to create certain obligations. And the essence of liberalism is that you do get to choose, and then you have to stick to it. Pactum sunt servanda, or you can be dragged to court, or an arbitrator, etc. Doesn't have to be the state necessarily. This is liberalism. So what we have argued is that individual rights are sufficient for the protection of liberty. I guess this has very much been a theoretical discussion, because in practice, the ideal communitarian dispensation is just as much of a fantasy as the ideal anarcho-capitalist liberal dispensation, where there is no government and there is total freedom. It just doesn't exist in reality. But let me conclude on a positive note. I really did enjoy this discussion, and I hope that no one was offended. I think this is great. I think that our leftist enemies would have totally lost their minds during this discussion and would have called us all sorts of names. I'm glad none of us did that. I consider my opponents to be friends, and I hope we can do this many more times in the future. And just on that point, and I really want to put my arm on the table on this point, AfriForum is one of the greatest and the best defenders and expositors of individual rights in South African history. And I think every liberal in this country should become a member, as I am, and support AfriForum in its defense, in its very strong defense of individual rights. Let's do this again soon.
Well, great. On that note, Ernst, I think you can jump in.
I think maybe just to start, I just want to really emphasize the last part, or agree with Martin's part, not only the AfriForum part, but about this debate being seen within the context of what it is. And maybe also on a lighter side, I think someone like Ferial Hafuji would be very confused watching this debate, because I remember her tweeting something along the lines of that we're all just the same, we all have the same views. So to conclude, I want to make a few just very short comments, and then I'll get to the point that I wanted to conclude with is those countries that are doing so well across the world are not only have so-called liberal governments, it's homogeneous countries. It's countries that has a very strong sense of community. Hermann in particular keeps saying that we're misrepresenting them, that we're calling them names and all of this. We're not calling anyone names. We're just saying that you need to live up to the consequences of liberalism, not only in theory, but also in practice. And we're pointing out to the consequences of this in practice. It's not name calling. What I'm concerned about, Hermann keeps saying that we didn't prove the point. We keep mentioning examples and then they keep just dismissing or ignoring the examples. I think the problem with this debate is a severe case of cognitive dissonance. And I'll get to that now. Viktor Frankl said that it does not really matter what we expect from life, but rather what life expects from us. That's a very anti-individualist type of statement. Now, the claim is that liberalism is sufficient for community rights. Nearly every single one of the promises that were made by liberalism has been shattered. Let me give you some examples. Liberalism promised maximizing liberty. It promised a decline in inter-ethnic conflict. It promised reconciliation. It promised flourishing communities. It promised protection of minority rights. It promised an independent judiciary, checks and balances, government for all the people, individual rights in theory and the realization thereof in practice. Liberalism promised accountable government. It promised a competent government. It promised separation of powers. The list goes on. You have to be an ideologue with suffering from a severe case of cognitive dissonance to still refuse to recognize that the theory of liberalism isn't efficient in practice. People don't die for individualism because individualism isn't worth dying for. Dying for your individualism is like having sex to remain a virgin. What is worth dying for? The greater good of the community is worth dying for. Ideas are worth dying for. Now, surely you can say that you are prepared to die for the idea of individualism, but that only means that you recognize individualism as something cherished by your community. To die for individualism of others is to die for communitarianism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernst, Hermann, and Martin. Just to also agree with what Martin said at the ending of his closing remarks, I consider all four of you good friends, and I've enjoyed beers with all four of you. And I really think this is a wonderful debate. And I think, like Martin correctly pointed out, this drives a lot of people in South Africa mad. You see the four faces of the Free Market Foundation, the IRR, and AfriForum together on a debate, disagreeing on topics. And I think that's what's so important about this debate and why it's such a good discussion to have. I really hope we can do this again soon. To all our listeners who tuned in, thank you so much for your time in spending this hour and a half or hour and 45 minutes together with us. And we appreciate your time. And to the four of you, thank you. This has been a really fun discussion to listen to. And we hope to see you guys again soon.
Yeah, I think I would also just like to repeat everything that was said. I think all the organizations represented here, whether that be the Free Market Foundation, AfriForum, or the Institute of Race Relations, I think are all worthy causes. And in the end, I think as you rightly mentioned, Daniel, I think the non-echo chamber nature of this discussion, I think, is really the breaking of the conditioning of our ideological opponents. And I think it shows a vibrance within our own, if you really want to call it, our side of the political spectrum, even though
our own community.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.